Everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to review the much anticipated Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. I feel like Sally Rooney is a writer that a lot of people are maybe interested in on the basis of how readers are first introduced to her work. I read Conversations with Friends a few years ago and I thought it was okay. I don't think it could really pull itself out of the trenches of contemporary fiction between in that time in the mid 2010s where everything was basically a template for the woes of everyday life. But I do feel like Beautiful World, Where Are You is a lot more like Conversations with Friends versus Rooney's sophomore novel, Normal People. I would say my preference is for Normal People if I had to choose between that and Conversations with Friends, mainly because I think Normal People had Rooney develop her writing a lot more strongly. But I actually like the contents of Conversations with Friends more and how those themes I think were more interpretive. But Normal People was definitely an improvement. So where in Conversations with Friends I felt like the characters there served more as templates to service the themes more. I liked more of the specificity between Connell and Marianne in Normal People, with their budding relationship becoming more revelatory towards their romance. The Beautiful World, Where Are You, with its characters, I would say, are much more deflated, distant, and desperate, which I really liked. And I think those feelings come with the territory, as where Connell and Marianne and Normal People were teenagers into their early 20s. Beautiful World, Where Are You kind of has more, I think it's the oldest age bracket between Rooney's works, because I know Conversations with Friends had early 20-somethings and also people in their 30s. But Beautiful World, Where Are You has everyone within their late 20s, early 30s. Those characters would be Alice, Eileen, Felix, and Simon. Each of them now well into their adulthood, where things in their late 20s now or early 30s feel a little less glossy. Or at least life feels like the 20-something trial period is running its course, as these characters are starting to think about and reflect on the relationships they've formed throughout these years, whether platonic or romantic. And all of the characters actually already know each other, except for Felix, who's brought into the fold, as we were introduced to the novel by Alice going on a date with Felix that they coordinated through a dating app. Meanwhile, I would say Eileen similarly meets Simon, but in a new way, being that they already knew each other years ago, but now Eileen is seeing Simon in a romantic light. And throughout the book, ultimately, all of these characters, but especially Alice and Eileen, feel this growing frustration with their relationships, or at least what they realize their approaches to their relationships. They are critically self-aware, not even because of their age within their late 20s or early 30s, that relationships are just things that people go through the motions with anyway, and that it doesn't make them special. As Alice and Eileen confide in each other through these ongoing email exchanges, as they kind of build up to anticipate meeting each other since they haven't seen each other in a really long time. And the emails themselves are actually quite interesting because Alice and Eileen often open them up by prefacing about some sort of really specific research that they've been doing for just things that are interesting them and how it relates back to their own personal life, which I honestly didn't pay much attention to the contents of what they were talking about, because I assumed it was meant to be long-winded at times and actually kind of boring. Because like I mentioned, how I think these examples that they're talking about at great length are really just a front in which they can just use that to eventually talk about themselves, I think on one hand is realistic, but also I think is a way to cycle back to what I mentioned about how they crave this specificity and finding ways to justify how they feel about their relationships in wanting to be unique and considered special. In a way, maybe the world being more forgiving and showing them mercy about trying to feel okay about these relationships that they're forming that are essentially making them suffer. Since the emails are actually sections dedicated to at least first there being a dedicated chapter where Alice or Eileen are giving their own thoughts and feelings about their life in real time, causing more of this unique unreliability in their email exchanges, because it's very much under the likeliness that they're just projecting their feelings onto what they're trying to tell each other through these later email exchanges, while also on the other hand also illuminating the characteristics between Alice and Eileen's friendship, being that maybe ultimately they just really are interested in talking about themselves, because they give their 2 cents about advice for each other at the end of each exchange, and always professing their love for their friendship, which I actually think on Rooney's part is an advantage in creating these layers of these faulty characters and maybe how they feel toward differences in friendship that's platonic and also their separate romantic relationships. Having two friends like Alice and Eileen that feel really comfortable with each other because it's very clear through talking about things in their emails like the Bronze Age that I feel like in your late 20s to early 30s, you're choosing those people that are likely like-minded as you and wouldn't mind talking about that kind of stuff at length and just finding that comfort in confiding that kind of information to someone else. When I think secretly, it's also Alice and Eileen just trying to give these links or dropping hints at how much they just generally yearn for connectedness, even if that's not something that they mutually make vulnerable and talk about at length within their emails, since they're so preoccupied with these like mini research essays that they really dive into. Kind of calling back to one of those themes of the characters in this book that I really enjoy, and I also think Rooney is just spot on with in her past works too, but I think it's just more heightened in Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I think that's her characters having this overwhelming sense of desperation. It's as if Rooney's characters try to exhaust all the words available to them to feel best at communicating with other people. As Eileen and Alice become frustrated with Simon and Felix in their own ways, they also do try having these mature conversations about intimacy and sex, where Simon and Felix actually give very sympathetic and enlightening input, not only for Alice and Eileen's sake, but also a way to mirror their own thoughts and feelings about relationships too. As we can interpret Simon and Felix this way through Rooney's use of flashbacks between information told from Alice or Eileen that maybe Alice or Eileen already fully knew, or maybe it becomes sort of this realization for them based on things they thought they knew about Felix or Simon, primarily Simon, since Alice and Eileen grew up with him as friends, in which this new information that causes this new perspective to form about what it means to really know somebody really makes both Alice and Eileen in ways just feel increasingly dumb. Not dumb in a sense where like they're characteristically dumb, but just where they feel a bit hoodwinked about what they thought they best knew or fully knew about people that they voluntarily want to keep in their lives. As it's a common pattern throughout this book that it seems like as new information is brought up, that these characters feel less threatened by the actions that feel associated with those new ideas, favoring instead this emphasis on how much these characters doubt and feel insecure about who they think they are based on who they thought these people are too. Which is ironic because the whole point of relationships is that you get to know someone indefinitely. But these characters all feel kind of at an intersection of trying to choose what to believe about other people, or really how that's actually a reflection of themselves in what they only want to see. And this is coordinated so effortlessly with Rooney's perfect sense of using dialogue. And in the process, she also, in the background, deflates these situational obstacles that often thwarts romance. For example, one character I think is like in mid-stream of consciousness mode, and then they decide to just show up at another character's house so they can hook up. And then another character gets super drunk, but between all the options he has, he chooses to call another character because that in itself, despite his state, is showing how much he cares for someone. These moments when reading them feel really serendipitous and kind of refreshing in that sense where it doesn't feel like Rooney wastes time in trying to have characters think about their actions, and where it feels impulsive and whether or not that's meant to match the fleetingness of romance and whether or not that's a good thing. Which leads me to have a point about Rooney's sense of control over the use of technology in this book. One example being that often with these constant apps that these characters are using, often unnamed, although inferred to be things like rideshare apps or dating apps, or even sometimes getting a format of conversation with a string of text messages, even to the specificity of a character just fixated on watching the ellipses that appear whenever someone's texting you back. I interpreted all of this as a way of Rooney just really like driving it home that if you really want to communicate with someone, interpret it as of the romantic nature, that you truthfully just can anytime. That in a way there's no excuses, because with our age now, with technology, with things like dating apps especially, you could just easily meet a stranger in your life and then they become important to you, much like how Alice and Felix met through a dating app. But even upon meeting and interacting in real life, Rooney is always conscious about these methodical approaches to getting to know someone, especially interpreting them under the lens of just being a crush. With at least every character in this book at some point choosing to use things like flirty one-liners or zingers, or in general just often cheeky banter, which I think is great because I think it calls back to, even though these characters feel constantly pulled or tugged to this idea of not feeling special, they do find comfort in this anonymity of the feeling of being whoever you want to be under the guise of attraction. And of course, with all of these characters being self-aware to this idea of modern romance, it kind of begs the question whether or not they're even looking for to achieve this sense of love. Instead, maybe more preoccupied by eventually getting to this future unknown of this identity waiting for them that involves them being in a romantic relationship, especially enforced by, again, the perfect sense of Rooney having great control over this choice of the third person narration. As some chapters actually often end with these powerful, albeit short, snapshots of the life beyond these characters' bubbles. Not only creating this great respite in terms of just everything going on, but again, that thematic reminder about the world at large and how ultimately these characters are looking for the supposed beautiful world and wondering where that is. Rooney writes, "Outside, astronomical twilight, crescent moon hanging low over the dark water, tide returning now with a faint, repeating rush over the sand. Another place, another time." And passages like this too make the whole relationship aspect even feel more trivial, which makes me feel sad for all these characters, enhancing that desperation factor that I really enjoy about this book and that I think is so strong. With these moments to me kind of reminding me of like in movies, whenever a camera slowly pans out, that's meant to signal the end of something, and where this writing technique pops up frequently, whether or not for the reader in different situations or different interpretations of Alice, Felix, Simon, and Eileen's relationships, whether or not that brings comfort or discomfort. Which on another hand, kind of also too, when reading like sections like this, makes me feel this dreamy universality toward the idea of romance and fate and about the world at large. If reading this like a romance novel, kind of ditching the idea of like the meet cute, which I love anyway, instead of this feeling in favor of the people you meet feeling like their own tiny worlds and trying to get to know them, and how that can be romanticized pretty often, but also how it feels like this place of solace, even if it's not about the person, but just about the idea. And again, with Sally Rooney's prose in this book being the perfect sandwich between the two ends being the characters that meet. The writing just really lush with generosity and patience. And while of course I've been really hammering down on the focus being Alice and Eileen, which I would say the book arguably is mostly about them, I think Felix and Simon, even if they feel a bit more understated, I think are quietly perfectly captured, mainly again based on this theme of both Alice and Eileen creating these portrayals beyond Felix and Simon's will, but they still become just as proactive about securing their own autonomy as people and how they want to be perceived. For example, with the part I really like where Eileen is with Simon and she's seeing him in this new environment, she goes on to say, "I know I keep saying how ordinary he was, but it was precisely the seeming absence of any change in his personhood, precisely the fact that he went on being fully and recognizably the same man as always, that was so mystifying to me." And then later, Eileen writes, "I think I would feel superficially sadder, but less fundamentally broken as a person, if I could just be sad about one breakup, rather than sad about my lifelong inability to sustain a meaningful relationship. I don't think it was the idea that I would miss him, because it never really occurred to me that I would, and to be honest with myself, I haven't. Sometimes I think I was afraid that without him, my life would be just the same, or even worse." And it's ideas like this that I think are super interesting based on those mature sentiments that both Alice and Eileen confide in each other, that they're surely capable of based on how intellectual they think about these random research topics that I think, again, are just a front of them trying to just talk about themselves anyway. But like I mentioned earlier, it is a bit perplexing because we know that Alice and Eileen well, they are overly educated, but it's not on the basis that they don't understand what casual conversation is. Based on what I mentioned earlier, they know how to have that flirtatious, cheeky banter through really casual text messages, reinforcing the decision-making skills that both Alice and Eileen have, as well as Felix and Simon, to where they are more accountable for their emotions and how they choose to portray that. Creating this great room for human error where it can never feel truly at fault of these characters. Like, I never know if it's me reading that they're unlikable, but it feels more like that these feelings could be happening to anybody at any time. And I would say between all of Rooney's works that A Beautiful World, Where Are You, in that sense, makes it feel as a reader more compassionate versus Rooney's previous works where it felt like it was often these blunders of miscommunication. Whereas here, I feel like characters are openly being vulnerable and trying to get down to solve the riddle of their relationships, which in turn does cause this book to be, of Sally Rooney's work, the most specific, because there's like so many dedicated sections to just literally being about these very specific parts of their everyday lives. And I think this can certainly be a turnoff, and I think like justifiably so based on how tedious the writing can be, but I think it's meant to really hammer down the theme of how both Alice and Eileen, if they claim to be people that are so observant and intellectual about everyday life, then I think it serves them well to constantly be perceptive pretty much all the time and sharing that with us as readers. And to me, it feels like Rooney is really taking notes from the early modernist era of literature, where writers like Virginia Woolf really were so enthusiastic about talking about this intangible symptom, I would say, of one's own loneliness and how to resolve that. And how Woolf's characters always charge towards life and trying to solve all of its meanings and mysteries. For the modernist era, how World War I was kind of this jarring sense of disillusionment toward life, I feel like Rooney is just trying to take that same sentiment and just upgrade it for the modern age. Because of how technology or public perception between these ideas of what Alice and Eileen are thinking about is this new disillusionment, but even more so how tragic that might be, where it's preferred how now we want to be disillusioned, making Alice and Eileen feel more paralyzed about their future rather than possibly liberated. Not only evident through the contents of their emails about all of these global concerns toward natural disaster or whatever else, but ultimately how they can imagine their future selves taking shape in a world that they can't possibly imagine in the future. Hence the title, Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I think this is driven home as early as in one of the first email exchanges between Alice and Eileen. Maybe certain kinds of pain at certain formative stages in life just impress themselves into a person's sense of self permanently. Like the way I didn't lose my virginity until I was 20, and it was so painful and awkward and bad. And since then, I've always felt like exactly the kind of person that would happen to. Even then, or even though before then I didn't. And now I just feel like the kind of person whose life partner would fall out of love with them after several years. And I can't find a way to not be that kind of person anymore. Please do not come for me in the comments with that Virginia Woolf comparison, by the way, because I love Virginia Woolf and I feel like obviously her characters drive these sentiments a lot more, like better, my preference through her novels, but in ways, this Beautiful World, Where Are You reminds me a lot of Woolf's The Waves, specifically with this choreography of characters just trying to find this resolution toward their approach to life and the meaning of their own relationships too. Ultimately, Rooney just trying to bring that same urgency towards life that I feel like Woolf captured perfectly herself. And speaking of this choreography, I feel like really it's the last 100 pages of Beautiful World, Where Are You, where I think Rooney really drives home, I think, her best work to date. As within these last 100 pages, it really all comes to a climax where a lot of the characters intersect, and the dialogue and the communication or lack thereof I think is totally perfect and just a pleasure to have concluded the novel with. Driving home again this theme of specificity as the novel itself, literally, whether tedious or whatever, I think it is trying to be this reflection of how all these characters ultimately crave that form of intimacy, whether blurring the spectrum between romantic or platonic. Living in a world, in the modern world at least, where technically speaking, it's supposed to be easier to find a partner, whether through technology advancements or you know, a friends to lover trope. Rooney really just knows how to lay out these perfect traps, or this bait, or a sense of feeling like you get closer to things you want. Even by the end, you realize you never wanted it all along. And how, again, all these characters feel so desperate, which I just love to read about through their portrayals. And I would say earnestly that these characters' pursuits of love or whatever else does feel really genuine, or at least not disingenuous or artificial or anything like that. And how I feel like often with negative associations to how people maybe talk about having met and then already being in a relationship, I think is a way of Rooney really trying to pit both Alice and Eileen as opposite ends of the spectrum, where Alice and Felix meet on a dating app and where Eileen and Simon meet as a friends to lovers thing. I think it just goes to show that you can't really put a template on how you can prepare oneself to try to establish those connections of what you want your relationship to be. And I think readers will enjoy, between Alice and Eileen's emails or whatever else throughout this book, that it's really what readers today, I think, are looking for. A sense of being able to confide in someone, whether through friendship or through romance, as we seem to live in a world that promotes this exhaustive vulnerability while trying to maintain a little bit of mystery of how you can be someone that's desirable or worthy of being opened up to. Which leads me to say, I would say this book is not happy by any means. I would say it's definitely like melancholic. Even if there may be those familiar tones of romance within a novel, I think those are certainly done well, but I think it'll really rely on whether or not people want to try to have these overly sort of descriptive passages about a character's thoughts like 24/7. And if that doesn't sound like your jam, at least there is one part of this book I haven't mentioned yet where basically everyone is at least a little horny. So if anything, maybe you'll get a kick out of that. But ultimately, as much as it is about this book, thinking about it by itself, with the Sally Rooney discourse, it really begs one to ask, do we need another book like this about millennial 20-somethings? Ultimately with this book, I would still say no, but I do think Rooney really does have a really compelling voice that really makes her stand out. On one hand, this being my favorite Rooney I've read so far, even between also, I think this is Rooney's funniest book because she's got some jokes in here. I do think Rooney is a writer that people enjoy more once they read more of her work, like in an evolving way. So I don't really know how this would work if someone read this as their first Sally Rooney book. Although I do think Rooney describes it best through her character Alice in this book, who, I don't know if I mentioned this, but Alice is actually a novelist, as there is some speculation as to maybe wondering why Rooney didn't just write an essay collection with those intellectual thoughts between Alice's and Eileen's email exchanges. People are suspicious on the basis of Alice being a novelist. It is much to the same background as you read more about Alice, that it seems like Alice is a stand-in for Rooney herself. And I don't think novels have to be responsible for giving us any real-world implications of, like, in this case, always thinking of Rooney as Alice, because I don't think that's really fair. But I do like, because of this, with Alice promoting these very, like, unique ideas about the world in which Rooney could very well share too. I do like that it makes Rooney wonder that she made this conscious decision to talk about all these things in fiction versus nonfiction. And ultimately, I don't think this book delivers in perfect execution because I do think it leaves things a little lingering to where it can't really decide what type of novel it wants to be on the basis of all these ideas specifically that Alice and Eileen talk about, and then kind of switching back and forth between the immediacy of the relationships that are shared with the reader with this book. But I think this is a book I'm going to think about for a really long time, and I really enjoyed my reading experience of it, so on a base level, I did like it. As ultimately, I think Alice herself, as the novelist of the group in this book, describes it best when she says, "Here I am, writing another email about sex and friendship. What else is there to live for?" If you read Beautiful World, Where Are You? I'd really love to know what you think. I'm looking here and I've talked about it for an hour. So yes, please let me know your thoughts on this book. Or if you've never read Rooney, whether or not maybe this will pique your interest in now trying to pick her up. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.